This is the Distinctly Detroit podcast, the only pod that explores why one wants to be in the D. I am your host, Fyodor Ship III, the director of the University of Michigan Detroit Center. Join me as I interview students, scholars, leaders, and innovators about living, working, and loving in Detroit. Good day, and welcome back to the Distinctly Detroit podcast, the only pod that explores what makes one want to be in the D. I'm your host, Fyodor Ship, and today the DDP speaks with a nationally recognized leader that wants Black Detroiters to buy back the block. He's a critical voice in Detroit's policymaking and revitalization efforts. His long-term goal is for Detroit to become a beacon of Black culture and Black innovation in community ownership and development. His short-term goal is to see Black Detroiters transform and take agency over their own communities. He sustains social and economic development projects that engage distressed communities in creating impactful resident-led change that improves livability for all Detroiters. Hundreds of Detroit, Hamtramck, and Highland Park residents have benefited from his knowledge of real estate development, focusing on small real estate projects and providing technical assistance to small developers is his passion. A former real estate attorney that obtained a Juris Doctorate from the University of Michigan Law School and a governor-appointee to the Board of Real Estate Brokers and Salespersons, the creator of the Better Buildings, Better Blocks program and current executive director of Building Community Value, Chase Cantrell. Thank you, Chase. Welcome.
Well, it's good to be here. That was quite the introduction, Fyodor.
Well, we're glad to have you. First question I have is, what inspired you to get into real estate?
Well, working for a law firm, actually even before I started working for a law firm, I interned at one firm in Detroit and one firm in Chicago. And the firm in Chicago, I'll never forget, a partner at the firm, we were out to lunch downtown Chicago in the Loop, and he was walking around pointing to buildings saying, back in 1975, I worked on this transaction. Back in 1983, I worked on this. So he was talking about things that he's been doing over 30 years. And I just remember at that moment thinking, wow, I want to be able to do that one day. And I didn't end up in Chicago. I decided on a firm in Detroit, but I can do that now. I can walk through the Cass Corridor, I can walk through downtown, and I can point to buildings saying, I worked on that project, I worked on this other project, and it makes me feel, even though I wasn't the attorney on those transactions, it makes me feel like I have ownership over my city. And I know we're going to get to it later, but now I do have some ownership over actual commercial property in the city. But that really sparked an interest in me to do more.
Okay. So can you tell me a little bit about the real estate market in Detroit? Like, who's buying properties in the city right now?
So it depends on what area you're looking at. So, I mean, we're sitting, on Woodward. So we can think about places like Bedrock and Sachse and others that are purchasing commercial property. So, I mean, there's a lot of real estate investment and development down here that's led by big corporations. But once you're in the neighborhoods of Detroit, the market is completely different. You have a lot of Detroiters who are actually buying property, which is why I lean into what I do. But you also have investors from around the nation and around the globe who are from afar purchasing property in Detroit, and that is something that I think many of us are trying to unpack and understand what the impacts of that really is. So what all of that means, though, is that there's a reinvigorated interest in the city. People actually see that there's a market here worth investing in which people can actually make money. So that is both good and bad for the city, depending on what your frame is and what your lens is.
Okay. Well, speaking of that, I've been reading a lot about corporations buying up property around the country. Mm-hmm. And what kind of impact is that having on real estate market?
So I'm thinking of Detroit specifically, right? Like, I'll lean into Bedrock as an example. They own hundreds of properties in downtown Detroit, and it has, in a sense, reinvigorated a market that a decade ago or more, some would say wasn't there. But even though that means that there's more investment flowing into the city, there's more interest in the city, there's also a cultural question of what are we creating? And I think that even larger corporations are beginning to ask themselves that question, right? We own all this real estate. We're investing in a majority black city, the largest majority black city in the nation. What does it mean, not from a corporate aspect, but from a cultural aspect, to invest in a black city? And that's something that we're just now beginning to ask, I think, in depth. And I don't think that the corporations who are investing really have a great answer to that yet. But again, it means that we're beginning to see movement in terms of the market here.
Okay. So how is the fact that it seems like a lot of out-of-state investors are buying residential property in the city? How is that impacting the market?
Well, one, there's been a wealth transfer in Detroit. And, when we talk about, reinvigorated markets, in the residential sense, what we've seen is this used to be a majority black homeowner city. In fact, it was a beacon for the rest of the nation. And now we're a majority renter city. So we've shifted in a way. And what that really represents is, because of foreclosures and overtaxation, we've really seen a stripping of wealth from black families and black residents to equity investors who many of them are white or non-black. And that wealth is now in the hands of people who don't look like me. So in a way, folks in power are celebrating the fact that people are investing in Detroit again. But what we don't often talk about enough is that, that has been a wealth transfer from black people.
Okay. And so you are taking this on directly, and you started your own consulting firm, but you also do education. So tell me a little bit more about this. What is Better Building Better Blocks?
Sure. So, there's a University of Michigan connection, so go blue. The curriculum was developed by Peter Allen. So Peter Allen, who's actually retiring this semester after decades of teaching in Ann Arbor.
I had him as a professor.
There we go. Lecturer at the Ross Business School.
Yeah.
He has been teaching for a long time the fundamentals of real estate to students at U of M. And he thought back in 2015, so I was still practicing law. I hadn't left my firm yet. Back in 2015, he developed a curriculum, and he started teaching here at the U of M Detroit Center. He basically got a free room. There was a grant to the School of Social Work, so there were multiple schools involved. But Janelle O'Keefe, who was at the School of Social Work at the time, helped him develop this course, and they just started recruiting mostly black Detroiters to teach them about real estate development. So a year later, I left my firm, and at the time it was called Real Estate Essentials, so that's what Peter started it as, Real Estate Essentials. I left my firm a year later, and essentially they found me, and they said, hey, we heard about Building Community Value, which is my org that I just started, and they're like, we think the way that you're describing your organization is perfectly in line with what we're trying to do with this course. Do you want to take the course over, essentially? And I sat in on the class in 2016, and I was like, wow, this is really amazing, actually, to see black Detroiters who are interested in real estate development, who are interested in their neighborhoods, who wanted to learn the craft, were learning the concepts and really understanding the concepts. So I said, yes, I want Building Community Value to take this over. We rebranded to Better Buildings, Better Blocks. So that's the name of the course, and it's been that for 5-6 years now. And we immediately set about the task of getting more money. So we applied to a lot of different foundations. The Knight Foundation was the first one in, and that allowed us to hire staff and really solidify the program and scale. So we've been, every cohort is about 30 residents from Detroit, Hamtramck, or Highland Park, and since it started, it's been over 300 participants now. So we are, what I didn't know at the time, I'm thinking that we're just teaching these concepts, right? What I didn't realize, and what's been beautiful to me as a Detroiter to see, is that we created a network. So, there are so many people who have gone through the course now that Detroit is, in landmass, it's a big city, but it's a village, right?
It's a big town.
It's a big town.
Yeah.
So, when I begin to see people who have gone through the course or who know each other, and see how people are beginning to work with one another, like we have all kinds of people with different skills who come through the class. So whether you're a contractor or a realtor or just a resident in a neighborhood, like folks have different skill sets and they begin to work with each other. And it's like, wow, okay. So now not only are we teaching concepts, but I'm trying to curate this network so people get to meet each other and know each other and work with each other. And it's
I
just
got a
been,
place you can bring people to meet.
I know. So as soon as we get past this pandemic, I am eager to get back to in-person learning and networking. But yeah, it's been an amazing journey to see really how Detroiters are coming together around this.
Yeah. So what kind of projects have come out of your program?
So the majority of people focus on single-family homes and duplexes. So, over 75% of the housing in Detroit, and this is unique in many ways to other major cities, we have a lot of single-family housing in the city.
Yeah.
And again, because of the foreclosure crisis, we have a lot of vacant residential. So a lot of them focus on that, but we also have some really interesting commercial that's come out of it. So, one alum who's an architect is doing a 2-story renovation on the east side on East Warren. We have another one who applied for an RFP through Invest Detroit. He won. He's doing a really innovative concept also on the east side. So we have both commercial and residential and people at all scales. So I'm just like a proud dad, just seeing people out here doing real work. And I will never forget, and I've begun to talk about this more because this was a lightning bolt for me personally. There was an RFP that came out, I think, in 2019, so pre-pandemic. And, there was an information session before the RFP closed, and I just showed up. I wasn't really interested in applying, but I wanted to see what it was about and who was in the room. And the city official who was leading the program was a BCV alum. The official from the CDFI, who was also part of the program, is a BCV alum. And about 10 other people who wanted to apply were BCV alum. And I just sort of was sitting back thinking, okay, there's 30 people in the room, about a third have touched BCV in some way. And I'm like, wow, okay, this is showing me in real time what my impact is and what the team's impact has been. And I'm just like, all right, this is really meaningful. And I'm beginning to see more and more of those in-person touch points where it's like, no, I actually see the physical evidence of what we're doing, and that really keeps me going.
Okay. But for the uninformed, what is a CDFI?
So a community development financial institution. So banks don't lend in places that they deem to be risky. And I can speak for a whole hour about the way in which communities of color are deemed risks. But CDFIs have been around for decades, but really in the 90s they began to give loans in some of these places. So we have some pretty major CDFIs. Some of the bigger ones in Michigan are here in Detroit. And again, that could be a whole nother session, but Invest Detroit being one, Capital Impact Partners being another, Enterprise Community Partners being another, Scenair is another. So, they do a lot of the lending in the city, and some of them actually own property and RFP that property out. So Invest Detroit was one of those, and they've done a number of RFPs throughout the city.
Okay. So what are some of the major obstacles to community-based real estate development?
Money. So, and that's the thing. There's not a lack of passion, right? Like Black Detroiters have wanted to do real estate development in their neighborhoods since Black Detroiters have gotten to Detroit. Yeah. And it's not lack of knowledge, right? Like people are out there not only taking BCV's course, but Capital Impact has one for more advanced developers. NDC, there are other organizations that also do things, and Black Detroiters are out there trying to get the knowledge. So really, it is how do we deem one? There's the neighborhood risk, right? So when lenders are looking at Detroit neighborhoods, even though market values are slowly beginning to rise, like oftentimes they're saying this is too risky as a bank to lend or a CDFI to lend. But then it's also the person. So if you are not part of a developer family, right? A lot of wealthy male white developers are part of families who have done development for a very long time, right? So there are names that banks recognize. So we don't have that same privilege. So you're deeming a community as risky, you're deeming individuals as risky, and oftentimes that means that people aren't getting capital. And that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you're doing a single family house or if you're doing 100-unit new construction. I talk to Black developers at all levels, and the barriers are very similar. It's lack of equity or lack of loan capital. So part of what my job is not only to teach the concepts, but it's to talk to banks, it's to talk to CDFIs, it's to, do interviews like this to let the public know what's happening. It's to write op-eds. It's really to educate as many people as I can in the ecosystem about the challenges and barriers that Black people have. And what I'm seeing, there's been a shift. There's been a shift in the past 5 years. Banks and CDFIs understand the challenge, right? It's not just that they're speaking the right language now, but they really do understand. Many of them understand what the challenges are, but there's a lag in changing the culture, especially at banks. I won't talk too much about CDFIs, but really at banks, their underwriting standards don't allow them to lend in many Black communities. So, those are the hardest conversations because those are the places where the most money exists. Like CDFIs, even they have challenges getting capital, right? But the money's at the banks, the cheap money's at the banks, and those are the ones who are slowest to move. So it's been an uphill battle.
It's redlining.
It's not redlining in the sense of the federal government, back in the 30s and 40s saying don't lend in these neighborhoods. But it still is banks essentially saying, don't lend in these neighborhoods, right? Yeah. In I'm going to forget the decade, but I believe in the 80s or 90s, like there are Community Reinvestment Act standards, right? So banks are supposed to lend in communities that are a little more risky, what they would deem to be risk. And a lot of banks aren't hitting their targets, right? And that's public data, and people can, look up CRA data for most banks, understand what they're lending against, where they're lending, who they're lending to. But for where we put our money, right, who you bank with, that they're not going to change their standards. So there really needs to be a larger public outcry about, who gets that capital.
I remember a few years ago, I was bringing in mind that Key Bank used to have a branch here in this building, but they established it for the specific reason that they were fined, I think, by the federal government or penalized because they weren't giving loans out to people in the city like they were supposed to.
Yep, and KeyBank, I don't even know if KeyBank is still around, but they used the Broderick Tower, so right up the street. That was one of KeyBank's transactions back in 2011. Bank of America used to do a lot more lending as well against development projects, and the market has shifted. So it's hard to get those big banks to do work in Detroit, even when again, the market's shifting and people have more confidence in the city, but it's still hard to get capital.
Okay. So what about the labor challenge? Because I know as a current homeowner, but also I own property in Detroit, and I tried to do some real estate development. One of the biggest challenges we had was finding qualified help. I mean, to help us do the rehab.
So two things on that. One, the development training model where you're teaching residents how to do development work, how to do a pro forma, how to talk to a bank, how to understand, how you deal with an architect or a contractor. That's one side of the problem or of the equation. The other side is who's teaching Black Detroit residents the contracting side, right? How do you start a construction firm? Capital. How do you find the capital for your insurance and your bonding requirements, right? So it is difficult to break into that as well. Like we all know, our brother or cousin or father, whoever who has the skill, but it's a different thing to formalize that skill into a construction firm. And even once you do, same problems as developers, are the larger construction firms actually hiring the right people? Are the majority developers actually looking to people of color for their construction talent? So similar issues on both sides. Capital is an issue on both sides. And I really haven't found that many community actors who are looking to Detroit residents to give them those skills, even though we're seeing some of it, vocational training. When I was younger, there was much more, and I'm not that old, right? But, there was much more vocational training in the city of Detroit. And, I graduated from high school in 2001. Within a few years, like Randolph closed, a lot of these other vocational centers closed. So we have a few more than we did, in the mid-noughts. So Randolph is back, Bright Hops is back. But we just don't have enough. We're not teaching our children either.
I just saw a post about the Carpenter and Millwrights just
Yep.
opened up a new facility in the city.
They did. So we're beginning to see, like, again, like cries of alarm. Like, we need more talent here, and we don't need more talent. The talent's already here, but we need more structures to get folks into the pipeline to get these jobs. And I mean, structurally, part of what happened is people left the city too. Great Recession hit. People who had those skills went to other communities where they could get jobs more easily. Like, development dried up in the city of Detroit 2008, 2009. It took years to get back to where we are now. People are in other communities doing work elsewhere.
Interesting. So one of the things I've been reading about and hearing about lately is something that phenomenon happened in Detroit is land trusts. How are land trusts a good option for community development?
All right, so there's a double-edged sword for land trusts. What we have in the United States is a housing crisis. Nowhere in the United States can someone rent a 2-bedroom apartment on minimum wage. So 50 years ago, you could have a minimum wage job and actually find accessible housing in most places. Nowhere in the United States is that possible now. So it's not just a Detroit problem, it's a national problem. We need federal intervention. But what essentially community land trusts, what they do is they keep housing affordable. So if right now, if I purchased a house for $100,000 and was able to sell it 10 years later for $200,000, I capture that gain. I made a profit, right? What community land trusts do is that they limit that profit. So, if I bought a house for $100K, I would only be able to sell it, for some threshold, maybe 110. So they're capping the amount that these houses can go up over time, which means the next purchaser can still access that reasonably at a reasonable price. So on the one hand, it keeps housing affordable. On the other hand, it also limits the equity that a new homeowner can create. So it's a Band-Aid, right? It's a Band-Aid for a problem because we don't have enough federal dollars, state dollars to really make housing affordable. So in the absence of that, some community development orgs are saying, well, this is a stopgap measure to keep it affordable. We can do this at the community level. For me, it's a tool in the toolkit. We should have some of that, but that's not the global solution. Like, the global solution is to build more housing. Like, we just need more units everywhere in the United States. It's to build more housing, and it's to ensure that when we're building new housing, that we're making rent affordable for people.
Okay. So, and this is maybe a broad question, but how do we increase home ownership in Detroit?
All right, so I'm going to sound like a broken record. The same problem that we're seeing for developers and for contractors, we're seeing it for homeowners too. So 2008 happened, the Great Recession hit, and mortgages dried up in the city of Detroit. Lenders were not lending to individuals to buy homes. And we are nowhere near back to the levels that we were pre-recession. So part of it is we have more housing agencies in the city than most other major cities. So those agencies that are teaching people the process to buy a home. Wayne Metro is one, Bridging Communities. Like there are so many. I think we have 16 or 17 in the city, where some major cities only have 3 or 4. So we have a lot of people learning about the process, a lot of just normal Detroiters who are going through these programs. On the other side, though, banks aren't lending to them. So there's a disconnect. So what we need to do, again, is to ensure that lenders are not seeing Detroit as a whole as a risk and actually beginning to lend to more Detroiters. Again, CDFIs, back to them, they are trying to intervene. Opportunity Resource Fund is one of those that do mortgages to individuals. And again, the demand is there, the resources just aren't. So that's what we need. We need a shift in banking again.
I think I read somewhere that Detroit is like leading the nation in cash transactions
We
for
are.
housing.
And the reason that is, and also that encourages outside investors to buy, but the reason that is that banks aren't lending at the scale that they should, or at the scale that they used to. They've tightened their belts, and they're just not lending at the same rates in the city.
Okay. So as we go through this challenge of getting more homeowners, you said the community Detroit is predominantly transitioned from a home ownership city into a renter city. how do we continue to or build community when it seems like everyone has an apartment mentality?
So I would push back just a little. I don't know that everyone does have an apartment mentality. Like the ecosystem that we're in is that if anyone, I was going to say young people especially, but if anyone wants to go to a bank to try to get a mortgage, the answer is likely no. So do that a couple times, you're gonna stop trying to do it. So it really is how easy is it to do what my parents did 50 years ago, right? Like I think of my parents who were in their 70s. They not from Detroit. They came to Detroit in '68 because there were jobs. There were good jobs for both of them. And by '71, they bought a house in what ended up being a transitioning neighborhood. It was majority white at that time. It very quickly became majority black, but they were able to go to a bank as young 20-somethings and get $21,000 for a house on the west side in a nice neighborhood. Um,
21,000 for a
21,000.
house.
Well,
Wow.
with inflation, that's like 100K now,
Yeah.
right? But even that, right? Like they were able to go and get a loan, and I'm thinking of 20-somethings now, who are working in retail or working middle income jobs, can't go to a bank and similarly get a mortgage. So it's structural. It's not the desire. I think people still want the same American dream, owning a house, building equity, but it's structurally we don't have the resources to make that happen anymore.
Okay. So interesting developments came up recently. You may have heard about it, but I was wondering if you might have any insight into the recent controversy involving Dave Chappelle.
Okay, so what we didn't mention at the top is that this year, for the first time, I'm teaching at U of M.
Okay.
So
Go Blue again.
Yeah, go Blue. So I'm a lecturer in Taubman, the
Okay.
School of Architecture and Urban Planning, and it's a real estate seminar. So it's called Disruptions in Real Estate. And literally last week, part of my class was to talk about this.
Okay.
And what I did is I took them through. It was a village council meeting. So it's a small village in Ohio, Yellow Springs.
I got family that lives there.
Yeah, and Dave Chappelle's a resident, so it's not like he's just some entrepreneur. He lives in Yellow Springs. And instead of just playing the clip of him, which is like a 36-second clip, I took them through. It was like a 2-hour meeting, and it wasn't the first meeting about this housing development. So I took them through the process to like listen to the council members before we got to Dave Chappelle. And I don't think we have enough information to really know if Dave Chappelle was against affordable housing. I think he was against the whole housing project, right? The affordable and the market rate. And it seems like he was pretty consistent about that for about a year, that the council was reviewing it. But the reason I took my students through this, and I want to take more Detroiters through it too, is to show, and I actually showed them Yellow Springs, I showed them a Livonia Planning Commission meeting, and I showed them a Detroit zoning meeting as well. And in each case, residents of those cities were saying, we don't want this development project in our neighborhood for different reasons. And it was to take them through, and every single project got denied by the city because residents showed up and said no. So it was an exercise in just showing
I think
resident.
they call them NIMBYs.
They call them NIMBYs, but
Not in my backyard.
not in my backyard. but the interesting thing, so Yellow Springs felt like NIMBYism. So did Livonia. But the one in Detroit, and this was literally this week, is a company that wants to put an asphalt factory in Grand Mount Rosedale. So on Southfield Service Drive, right where Southfield and 96 intersect. And you can imagine that residents.
Asphalt and Grand Mount Rosedale don't mix.
Right. That doesn't mix. And it's right there on Southfield Service Drive. And you can imagine that residents were just incensed.
Yeah.
So it's not like the housing question. Like the folks in Grand Mount Rosedale were saying, there are clear studies about the health impact, the negative health impacts of having an asphalt factory in our backyard. We, put this somewhere else, put this in an industrial zone, don't put it close to us. So it was still not in our backyard, right? But for more rational reasons, right? Like this is going to cause cancer. This is going to have a negative impact. So I'm just trying to get people to know, especially Detroiters, that zoning is, as boring as it is and as complicated as it is, like has real impacts on our lives. And I don't think that people think of some of the structures in city government in that way. But I'm glad to see the folks in Grand Mount Rosedale saying no. But similar, like residents have power.
Yeah, that's cool. Well, no, what I read about Dave Chappelle was that it was a 25-acre development. And of the 25 acres, they set aside 1.5 acres for affordable housing. And then the rest of the land was going to be $300,000 and $400,000 homes.
That's right. But so it was even bigger. It was double that. It was like 50
acres.
50
Okay.
acres, 50 plus acres. And you're right. There was a nearly 2 acre set aside for affordable housing that the developer wasn't going to do.
He was going to let them
They were going.
develop.
He was going to let the village develop
Yeah,
it. Like you guys can.
very kind of him.
You guys can put out a request for proposal, an RFP. You can figure it out. I'm going to gift that to the city. But Oberer, the name of the developer, they weren't going to do it. But the important thing for the residents at that time to know is that even if they shot down the affordable plan, Oberer had the right to move forward with their original plan, their original solely market rate plan, which is what's going to happen. So what one of the council members said was they believe Dave Chappelle. So this is why I encourage people to watch all of these meetings, that Dave Chappelle wanted to not only vote down the current proposal, which had the affordable, but he wanted to put so many barriers in place such that Oberer left completely. Like he wanted the whole project to die. But yeah, like residents, other residents also had some other ideas, right? Some wanted a referendum for the city. Others wanted to see other processes, but that's what happens when citizens show up. And Yellow Springs ended up denying it. So yeah, that's what happens.
Cool. Go Dave. Go Dave.
Yeah.
So as you started this at the top, you touched upon this a little bit, but you've done a lot of teaching, and now I understand you're starting to do some doing. And you're getting your own real estate development.
That's right.
Can you tell us a little bit about your project?
Yeah. So there are 3.
Okay.
The project that I've been working on the longest, which is set to open this year, it's a 1-story commercial building like we would see in almost any corridor in the city. It's on 6 Mile just west of Livernois. And it has been...
I was just there the other day at SIP on 6.
All right, so this is the interesting
door.
part.
Yeah.
The project is next door. You
Yeah.
probably saw it.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's been quite a journey to get this done. So it's been vacant for over a decade. And the longer these buildings sit, the more they deteriorate. And sometimes it's hard to really know the extent of the deterioration until you're in the building stripping pieces away, right? So it's not just this, but most projects in Detroit are more expensive than you think when you start. So we had to replace the entire back facade. We replaced the entire front facade of the building. But in the end, it's going to be retail, a tap room from a black-owned brewery that's moving into Detroit, and then there's 2 restaurants. So it's 8,000 square feet. It's a really big space, and we're almost there. I can see the finish line. And we're buying another commercial building in the neighborhood as well. It's very similar, single-story commercial building. But the really cool one that is really only getting underway is in Corktown. So the other 2 that I talked about are my own personal projects, my own money,
Okay, so they're not part of the Live 6 initiative?
They're part of the Live 6 initiative, but they're not through the nonprofit.
Okay.
Yeah, but the Corktown one is through the nonprofit. It's through Building Community Value. Another nonprofit sold us vacant land directly in front of Michigan Central Station, literally directly in front. And the goal is we teamed up with U of M, so it's a partnership with the University of Michigan, and we're creating an equitable development scorecard for the city. We've already developed it, we're testing it. So essentially it puts power into the hands of residents to tell developers, work with developers to determine what gets built. And really hold developers accountable once the process is underway. So we've begun some soft talks with residents of Corktown to see how this will go. And this year, since we're beginning to slowly move out of the pandemic, we're going to be able to have some in-person meetings to really delve into this. But the goal is to really start construction next year. So we have quite a bit of work to do, but it's exciting. If the model works, we will encourage other developers to use the same model.
Okay. Chase Cantrell starting his own development family.
There you go.
I love it. Okay. We are going to transition a little bit to what we call our lightning round. This is where we ask a series of questions through every guest that comes here, just kind of build up a catalog of what their answers would be.
All right.
And the first question is, how do you practice self-care?
Many ways, but probably my favorite way is travel. I love to travel. I've lived abroad before, and yeah, I'm always trying to, especially now that we can work virtually. I'm trying to travel as much as possible. So I went to Paris at the end of last year. I love going to places around the region: Chicago, Cincinnati, Columbus, Cleveland. So yeah, that's my self-care.
So you
travel.
like to travel.
Yeah.
Okay. What are you reading?
There's a good book called The Sum of Us by Heather McGhee. Good friend of mine recommended it, and I'm probably halfway through. So if any of our listeners, especially are Caucasian, I would really recommend this because it goes through the history of racism in the United States, but it talks about the ways in which white Americans will put barriers and challenges in the place of non-white people, but also to such an extent that they hurt themselves. So they talk about things like when pools had to be integrated, white communities throughout the United States drained the pools. So not only were they restricting our access, but they no longer had that amenity. There are so many examples of that. So she takes us through the history of racism from a very unique lens, I think. So great read.
Yeah. They drain the pool, bleach it, and then spend all that money to refill it.
That's exactly right.
What are you listening to?
So my musical tastes are eclectic, or diverse, maybe is a better way of saying it. So I listen to all kinds of stuff. But I will say that this is a plug. I love two stations I love: WDET, the local NPR station here, and since we're on a border city, CBC Radio, so we can get the Canadian stations. And both they do classical, they do pop, they do jazz, they do all the genres. But probably my favorite, I never miss it every week, is Soul Saturday. So WDET, it goes through R&B, neo soul here in Detroit. So yeah, WDET.
I have to check that out.
Yep.
What are you watching?
So it's interesting. I don't watch that much television these days. Probably one of my favorite. I might get the title wrong. There's a great show on PBS. It unpacks, and I'm going to forget the title. It unpacks people's ancestry. So I'm on my own ancestry.
Skip Gates, the Skip Gates show.
Henry Louis Gates. So he takes people of all descents back through their history, sometimes like crazy amounts of time back in history. And I don't know, it's just fascinated me. I myself have gotten back to like the 1870s with my family, and I'm still trying to get back farther. Like slavery, of course, presents some challenges. So I love that show.
I've gone back to being able to identify my great grandfather who was born in 1855, something like that, and was freed as part of the Civil War, and go on. But I can't find any of his family members or cousins or whatever. But I've done the Ancestry DNA and the 23andMe DNA and all of that stuff, and I hit for like 2,500 family members on 23andMe, but I don't know any of those people. So the Ancestry stuff is fascinating.
But the reason, just to lean into it a little bit, like the reason I love it is I've seen people who have, like, by hook or by crook, have got land, right? And it's fascinating to me. It's just like, how did my great grandfather get like 80 acres of land in Ohio? And he actually got a loan for it. We're talking about capital. Like he went to a white bank. I don't know how he did that. My great got land from the federal government in Arkansas. It's just like, again, like how was he able to accomplish that? So it gives me perspective on what I can do, because I'm like, so my ancestors did things that blow my mind. So there's no challenge that I can't face here.
Well, that sparks a question I ask. How do we address, because as someone who inherited property from a family member, how do we address that gap between someone having land and being able to afford to maintain it? Because there's a cost of ownership that many people overlook.
That's a difficult question. So one thing I don't know that we think a lot of, like we think of the way that we own and maintain land as an individual pursuit. And I see white developers and white landowners teaming up in ways that I don't always see us do. And even when I talk to elder black developers about, hey, what kind of joint partnerships are you thinking through? Like, how do you work with other people who own land? It's very siloed. It's like, this is mine. This is what I'm going to do. So I think part of it is thinking of, if it's difficult for an individual, is there a community solution, right? Like, is there a community development org that can help? Are there other neighbors who can help? Like, are there joint ownership models to make things work? But we really have to think of how we work together, like, because the alternative is losing the land. So you have to look beyond yourself to other solutions.
Okay. Where do you like to go out to eat in the city?
So I'm a foodie. I love eating out in all kinds of places. So after this interview, I'm probably going to go pretty close. There's a Vietnamese place called Pho Lucky.
Yep.
Love that place. But actually, I have a running list. So me and my partner, I have a running list of some of the fancier restaurants that I want to try, and we've been checking off the list. But I mean, some of my more expensive favorites are like Selden Standard. Actually, Selden's probably my favorite, so I would just say that. But Selden, Ima, Pho Lucky. I love that Ima, although it's a Japanese restaurant, it's black-owned, right? And then all the stuff that's happening.
Black-owned Japanese restaurant.
Black-owned,
I did not know that.
And he has 3 locations.
Oh, wow.
He started in Corktown, he has one in the Cass Corridor, and he has one in Madison Heights. And he's doing really well.
Can't call it Cass Corridor, no, man. It's Midtown.
It's Cass Corridor. Because literally it's on Cass. So, like, I will lean into that. But what's happening on Woodward by the Boulevard is insanely in a good way. Like, we have Baobab Fare, so African cuisine. We have Yum Village, which is another black-owned restaurant. We have Kitchen by Q. Like, we have all of these black restaurants, and Joe Louis Southern Kitchen that just opened. It's like this little, nexus of all these black restaurants, and they're all really good.
Okay, cool. And what is something that someone visiting Detroit has to do while they're here?
There's so many things. One, I think it's visiting the jewel of the city, which is Belle Isle. Even though culturally Belle Isle has changed in some ways over the past years, but so I would say that visiting our cultural district, right, going to the Charles H. Wright, seeing the DIA, but really getting into community. Whenever friends visit Detroit, there's some nervousness or trepidation about going out in the neighborhoods. Like, people want to stay on Woodward between the river and the boulevard, right? But I'm just like, there are so many, locally owned bars and restaurants and all the retail shops on our corridors. Like, I think of, like, if you drive down 7 Mile, just as an example, West 7 Mile between Greenfield, like, all the way to Evergreen. Like, you have so many eclectic retail shops, right? And small little restaurants and all kinds of things that if you're a resident, sure, you're going to try the soul food place up the street, or you're going to go to that African print shop. But I don't know that residents are thinking of telling their friends to go to those sorts of corridors when they're visiting the city. So to me, it's like, get outside of downtown Midtown, visit a neighborhood.
That's interesting. Okay. And then the last question we have for you is, where can we find you?
So first, I would tell people to visit BCV Detroit on Instagram, on Facebook, on Twitter. But for me personally, also Detroit Spirit on Instagram. So I love murals, I love art, and my Instagram page is just full of murals, not mostly in Detroit, but also from my travels around the world. So BCV Detroit and Detroit Spirit.
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us today. We really enjoyed having you.
My pleasure.
And ladies and gentlemen, Chase Cantrell. And again, this has been the DDP. I'm Fyodor Ship. I want to thank you all for joining us today. Please get our pod wherever you get your pods. Subscribe, like, and share. And see you next time. Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Distinctly Detroit podcast. This is a production of the University of Michigan Detroit Center, and you can find us anywhere you get your pods. Please rate, review, and subscribe. This podcast is directed and produced by Marlon Franklin, edited by Taylor Henniger, with writing contributions by James Neely and Leah Allen. Thank you for listening.